the haunted houses weren't. There was no demons. There was nothing like that. The one we went in, there was known to have all this terrible things, and they would put me in a room. Here's how they did it. They'd walk me and some other mediums around. I would walk into a room and there'd be a gentleman there with a clipboard or a lady couple, and they would just say, "What do you get from this room?" And I remember this one room I went in. I didn't know afterwards what they said about the room, but I went in there and I said, I don't know, I feel confined in this room. And I said, it feels like people are kind of stuck here sometimes. And I said, and not ghosts. I said, people, whatever this room was, it's not being used for what it was used before. And I said, I feel shackles. So I said, I don't know if this was a prison room and they kept prisoners here or something. And I said, and then I got this dude in my head and I was like, what is this place? And he said, it's where they kept people. I'm like, for what? And he's like, prison. I'm like, okay. And I said, who is in here? And he said to me, all their names are on the green ledger in the museum. I went, okay, thanks. And then I went to those guys and I said, it feels like there's a prison here. There's a gentleman that's still watching over it. He's very cool. He said you can find all the names of the prisoners in a green ledger at the museum. And I didn't know. I was in the middle of Indiana and the corn cobs. And they both look at each other and they're like, where? I said, the museum. I said, is there a museum around? He said, yeah, right uptown. There's a museum for this place. I said, oh, well, check it out. Anyway, they found out the next day. They said, the green ledger's in the museum.
That's
and
crazy.
It's under glass. Yeah, and they made sure that was a room where people were whipped and hurt and all that stuff. No, it was literally a prison. They kept people down there. It was an old asylum at some point. And there was also another woman in there she killed herself in there. And so they made her room really terrible. And I was in there and I talked to her and she wasn't crazy or mean. She did kill herself. She was put into that home because she had, she was going through, was it menopause or something like that?
Uh-huh.
So back then they didn't acknowledge that. And the husband dropped her off at this psycho place.
You can't go batshit crazy when you're going through menopause. That's for sure.
Exactly. And they put her in there and that's what she was. And yeah, she hung herself in there. She didn't want to be there anymore.